Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Payson Library. I'm Mark Reesedina Libraries, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this morning's session. We're so pleased to partner with procon.org, the Village Voice, and the Division of Political Science here at Pepperdine to bring former U.S. Representatives David Jolly and Patrick Murphy here today to speak with all of us. One of our central commitments as a library is to support the informed and balanced exploration of diverse viewpoints. So we're delighted that Kamy Akhavan and Jean Ring at Procon offered us the opportunity to host this morning's event. We're especially pleased to be joined today by our colleagues from Seaver College and Dean Pete Peterson, who I believe is on his way from our School of Public Policy. So welcome, colleagues. So without further ado, I want to tell you a little bit more about Kamy Akhavan, who will be facilitating the conversation this morning and introducing our speakers and moderating the panel. Mr. Akhavan is the CEO of procon.org, the nation's most used and trusted resource for representing the pros and cons of issues. He serves as on the advisory boards of Action Civics LA and Critica, and for decades he's worked to improve the quality and accessibility of civics education and debate. He has been interviewed on TV, radio, and his work has appeared in print, including Reuters, Associated Press, Fox News, ABC, CNN, CBS, and others. He was born in Iran and grew up in southern Louisiana and has lived in California for over 25 years. He holds a BA and MA in history from UCLA. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. Akhavan to the podium.
Thank you, Mark, for that introduction. It's a bit confusing, right? Iranian and Southern California and path through South Louisiana. It's not a typical path, but what I found about living in here in Los Angeles is that we all have this path, where I thought I was the one and only person with such an odd path. Every single person in this room has had their own journey for why we ended up here looking out the window over the Pacific Ocean here on the beautiful Pepperdine campus. So thank you, Mark, and thank you, Pepperdine University. This is an incredible university. We work with this university with some regularity, particularly with the policy school here, and can't say enough good things about your openness to free speech and dialogue and encouraging civil discourse. It is something that should be celebrated and should be replicated on campuses around the nation. So bravo to you, Waves. I want to briefly preface our talk today in a historical context, and I want to talk about the Constitutional Convention. So go a little bit back, right? And this is in the late 1700s when Ben Franklin, right, one of the founders, emerged from the Constitutional Convention and was asked on the street, and many of you probably know this story, he's asked on the street, Mr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us? You know what he said? He said, a republic, if you can keep it. How many of you are concerned that maybe we won't be able to keep it? Maybe there's a little bit of, I'm not sure if this is going to work out, right? And a lot of us have that concern, honestly. This is something that we have to support generationally. It doesn't just happen. The magic didn't happen once. The magic has to happen every day, every day, every day, every day. Particularly, we've got a midterm in a couple weeks. It's got to happen then, too. We have been gifted as citizens with two superpowers, our voice and our vote. And we hope that we celebrate that you're using both of them as students. Now, Ben Franklin set the stage for the republic if you can keep it. We know the power's in our hands. It has to be. That's how this system was designed. I want to talk about how it feels like the power is not in our hands because of the gridlock and the partisanship in our nation today, and specifically about one statistic that really floored me, which was a Pew Research study that was done in 1950 when they asked parents, would you object if your kid married somebody who is of the opposite political party as you are? Right, it's about love. Would you be upset if your kid married someone who wasn't of a political party? 1950, that percentage was around 8%. So it's a few parents. Same, flash forward to the present, same survey from Pew. Know what that statistic was at? 60%. Would object if their kid married someone of the opposite political party. The party mattered that much. And it feels that way when you see gridlock in Washington. We see it in our states. We see it in our municipalities. It is not just depressing, but we are scary divided. It's not my term. It's one that's floating around there. Scary divided. We don't want to be scary divided. We want to bridge those divides. And boy, do we have some great examples of bridging divides. ProCon has been championing bridging divides for 15 years now, and we've served over 180 million people since we started. Celebrate that. We also celebrate an awesome example of that here on campus, and those are going to be our moderators for today. Our moderators for today, very proud to have met these folks today. It's Garen and Austin. Garen and Austin are probably celebrities here on campus, both double majors, so I'll start here with Garen because he's closer. So Garen, you know, is a senior. Garen's a double major, poli-sci, and economics. Garen is the president of, in my mind, everything, but specifically three things. So he's the president of the Phi Alpha Delta pre-law fraternity. He is the president of the Armenian Student Association, and for our point today, he's also the president of the Pepperdine College Democrats. Garen's been working on a lot of things, including having brought Ben Shapiro to campus. Ben Shapiro, right? He should not like Ben Shapiro, but he believes that much in civil discourse that he worked awfully hard to get him on campus. He's also been working on Armenian genocide recognition on campus specifically. So, Garen, thank you for doing all of those fabulous things in your career. And I want to quickly pivot and acknowledge your co-moderator for today, and that's Austin. So Austin, also double major, right? You're studying business administration and poli-sci, and you are earning a certificate in dispute resolution from Pepperdine's law program. Good for you. It's a lot. You're doing a lot. You also helped bring Ben Shapiro to campus, but you worked with Garen. And you know what's so interesting to me is, in addition to all of your many kudos and accomplishments as a student, and the things that you're doing just as a citizen, a concerned person in this world, you are not just doing it as an advocate, you're living it. You guys are roommates, and you are, which I find so odd and wonderful, that your roommates, the head of the College Republicans and the head of the College Democrats, universities everywhere, if you are taking note, please observe these two and make it mandatory for campuses to do that. Put the two of them in the same room together, and look what emerged, this great model of civil discourse. I cannot emphasize my pride for what you have accomplished more. So bravo to you both. You will be leading our discussion today, so I will drift into the background. I do have a microphone, and I will use my power for the purpose of just keeping the dialogue brief and keeping the dialogue civil. Otherwise, we're going to focus on our esteemed guests here today, which I know Austin and Garen are very eager to introduce. So without further ado, it is your floor, gentlemen.
All right, thank you guys all so much for being here this morning. It's great to have you all here. As he introduced, my name is Austin Welch. I serve as president of College Republicans here, and then my great roommate over here on the end.
Yes, I'm Garen Kosoyan. I'm the president of College Democrats.
And I think instead of us trying to introduce these two incredible people in between us, we can kind of let them do that for themselves. But, gentlemen, take it away.
Go for it. Your turn today. I was first yesterday, so your turn.
Well, thank you all for the opportunity for us to join you. Thank you to Pepperdine, to the host, to the moderators today. Patrick and I each served in Congress, and probably as a foundational principle, the thing to best understand is I was a Republican in a district that President Obama had won twice. So relatively a 50-50 district by the numbers, but a Republican in a district that a Democratic president had won. Patrick, very similarly, a Democrat in a Republican-leaning district. And as it turned out, our approach to politics was similar. Each of us, the first time we ran for office, it was Congress. My very first race, when I got into it, I was polling at 1.5%. And the margin of error was 4. And I got into it with all of the naivety and the Pollyanna spirit that it really, truly could be a community race. And in many ways it was. Frankly, I won that race by about 2 points, a little less. And I do think there was a bit of a heart and soul community piece to it. But the reality was I got injected into modern day electioneering. And all of the rules and constructs that come with that, what is required to be successful in today's political environment, unfortunately is not what Ben Franklin had in mind when the founders first developed it. We will never extract raw politics out of politics, and we're not here to suggest that that would even be possible if we wanted it to be. But we do know that in the last 3 to 4 decades, through very deliberate actions, by both parties, but just because of who's been in the majority more, largely by Republicans, they have perfected a way to kind of strangle some of the oxygen of the system and rig it in favor of incumbency and rig it in favor of the major parties. So we touch on a few things that we'll talk about at length, the structural challenges that prevent bipartisanship. We talk about gerrymandering and the role of supermajority districts that ultimately incentivize people to make decisions that are more partisan. We talk about states that have a closed primary system, again, where your audience is only those members of your same party, and your pathway to re-election is by speaking only to your own party, not to those across the aisle. The influence of large money on both sides of the aisle and what that does to keep partisan actors more partisan and to keep them home. We'll talk through a number of these issues, and two important points that I want to make sure we establish at the beginning. A lot of the structural challenges we see that prevent bipartisanship can be fixed, and we're seeing fixes across the country. Most of those fixes are beginning at the state level, where voters at the state level are trying to amend their state constitutions to roll back some of these structural restrictions. So you see, for instance, in California, a move to a primary system that's top 2. You see in Maine, a ranked choice voting. You see in Arizona, to try to address gerrymandering, voters said, we don't want politicians to draw lines anymore. We want an independent commission. In Florida, we'll probably see an open primary ballot initiative in 2020. And largely, the U.S. Supreme Court has said, as long as voters are driving these initiatives and they don't violate certain heightened classes or constitutional protections, it's okay. It's a free-for-all in this democracy where we can roll back some of these structural challenges and level the playing field. Which brings me to the last point of the opener is this. What we are talking about doing on this tour, if you will, is leveling the playing field, to give all voices the same opportunity to compete. A lot of times in politics, you quickly get labeled with your ideology, you get labeled with your partisan affiliation. Patrick and I would say more people than not would say we're each moderates, right? As a moderate Republican, though, that means conservatives call me a rhino progressive. And the people on the left are still happy to say, well, he's a crazy Republican conservative, Tea Party crazy. The reality is, through both our message and our voting record, we both get labeled moderates. We're not suggesting, though, being a moderate is the answer to all these issues. We're not suggesting that people need to revisit your ideology and consider shifting your ideology towards the middle. Too often in conversations like this and on news, we conflate ideology, being a moderate, with being bipartisan. And they're two totally separate things. Being a moderate is a choice of ideology, just like being a progressive or a conservative. Wherever you are on that spectrum, God bless you, fight hard for it. What we're talking about is not ideology, but about bipartisanship. How do we unrig the system, create a level playing field that not only encourages people from all walks of life and all over the ideological spectrum to work together, but incentivizes them to do so and rewards them for doing so. Because if you put a reward in front of somebody, they're going to behave in a way to achieve that reward. So if we can roll back some of these structural challenges, we will begin to see behaviors change among elected officials, regardless of their ideology, and realize, you know what? If these two guys can room together and he and I can work together, voters now are going to reward that, because ultimately voters are asking for us to get more done and be more productive in politics and in Washington. So thank you all for the opportunity to be here. I will say, about 25 schools in, this is the coolest venue we've been in ever. I don't want to leave.
Yeah, can I get an application? My gosh, this is awesome. And yeah, seriously, I mean, I think members of Congress should be roommates, from the two parties. I mean, what a great idea for them. But anyway, thank you all for hosting us. We really look forward to your questions and like to try to keep this informal and have it more of a conversation. So thank you again for hosting us and for your leadership, the two of you, and what you're doing. And Kamy, thank you. Real quick bio. So from Florida, we're both from Florida. Never in a million years saw myself in public service. Grew up in a household, a construction family. My dad's a Republican, never went to college. When I registered to vote, I register as a Republican because that's what my dad was, and he's my best friend and mentor. So I was like, oh, I guess I am too. And in school, I double majored in finance and accounting. I ended up getting my CPA license, worked at Deloitte. So like the furthest thing from politics, right? And there's 8 CPAs in Congress. I'm a total outsider. Then 2010 came around, the BP oil spill happened, if you all remember that. There was a lot of talk of that oil coming, through Florida's coast, so started a little environmental company, and I really started to see government's impact. And if you remember in 2010, that was the Tea Party kind of start. And I was here a Republican, and I'm listening to the Tea Party and the sort of extreme, what I thought extreme views, saying, holy cow, I don't agree with that. And not only do I not agree, but the issues being discussed, like climate change and student debt and immigration and health care and the debt and the future of work are all going to affect our generation, your generation, more than our parents and grandparents. Yet none of my friends were involved. None of my friends really voted. None of them were doing anything about it. So I said, who the heck am I to sit around and complain? Might as well get involved. And it sounds sort of silly in hindsight, but I basically went through a set of about 25 issues and went through and I said, hey, I'm actually a Democrat. I'm fiscally responsible, socially more progressive. And right now, the way the parties were aligned, I couldn't run as a Republican. So I actually changed parties to a Democrat, ran against a Tea Party member of Congress named Alan West, and won in a landslide of 0.6%. Landslide Murphy. So it was turned out to be like one of the most expensive congressional races. Dave and I both had like $20 million congressional races, which is crazy if you think about a 2-year term, $20 million for these seats. And both had eye-openers to how broken the system was right off the bat. Because like any of you and ourselves included, we went naive in a sense, right? And we're going to change the world, and I was going to rewrite the tax code, and I was going to cut the debt, and I was going to prevent climate change, like all these big things, right? Why else run for Congress? And then you get there, and the first thing they do is they say, no, Patrick, look, you're a Democrat. You're not going to meet the Republicans. You're us. We're going to put you in the room over here, and David, you're a Republican. We're going to separate you. And right off the bat, you start getting like indoctrinated into a certain philosophy. I said, well, that's crazy. If we're going to get anything done, we got to find the middle ground here. We got to be bipartisan, and it just didn't make sense. And one of the first bills that I put forward was a bill to cut about $350 billion in wasteful government spending, right? Vanilla, right? We'd all agree. Cut the wasteful spending. This is our taxpayer money. It should be spent wisely. So I'm working with a Republican. We're getting ready to introduce this bill, and he comes to me, and he's like, hey, Murph, listen, I need a couple weeks before we can introduce this. Something happened. All right, I don't think anything of it. Long story short, 6 weeks goes by, and he comes to me one evening. We're out and about, and he's, hey, listen, I got a problem. I can't do that bill with you. What do you mean? Why not? It's like, well, Speaker Boehner, who was the speaker at the time, found out we were working together on this legislation. And he said, we're trying to beat Murphy. That's a seat we need to win back. And we're going to spend millions of dollars to beat him. We can't work with him and give him a headline that says Murphy cuts wasteful spending, right? That would help him in his reelection. So if you work with him, we're going to cut you from your committees, and we're going to make sure you don't raise any money, so you better not do it. So my, I thought, friend, Republican, was, well, saying, I'm sorry, maybe if you're here in like 5 years, we can do this together, but for now, I can't. And it hit me right off the bat. I mean, I'd just gotten elected, and this happened to me, that people were putting their party in front of their country. And then I started to understand the structural reasons why that was happening. And Dave and I, kind of make the point that of all the issues that we can all talk about, they're all so important. But unless we fix some of these structural problems, we're never going to have a real conversation about those issues and be able to have a real debate to get the best resolution, the best policy forward, because the system's being manipulated right now. And we think we can improve it. And that's why we're taking the time to do this tour, because in some ways it's really got to be your generation that leads on this and gets involved and takes the time to vote and get involved in social media and all the other things that are necessary to do this. So it's somewhat of a pessimistic message because it's so bad right now, but we do think there's an upside to it. So I look forward to that conversation.
Great. Thank you both so much. I think we kind of heard your kind of the most difficult, frustrating part when you entered Congress, but Congressman Jolly, we can maybe hear from you what your most frustrating kind of point was when you entered Congress.
Fundraising. I actually, I don't know if I'm conservative or not. I guess it depends on, it's in the eye of the beholder, but I had taken a fairly conservative approach to the constitutional provisions around money in politics, I accepted that money was speech and that therefore, little regulation on it, on giving was appropriate. I ended up making, frankly, a political value judgment that abandoned some of those original constitutional convictions and said, money has so corrupted today's politics and has so distracted elected officials from the actual role of governing that early in the process, as I kind of came out of the cauldron and the fire, I became an avid campaign finance reform advocate. So much so that, in a lot of ways, I kind of risked my brief career by going on 60 Minutes and exposing the culture of fundraising. The fact that members of Congress, the number one responsibility every single day is fundraising. And any member of Congress who tells you otherwise is lying. Let's put that out there. It's on both sides of the aisle. We know it by practice, by behavior. Every member of Congress has to spend hours upon hours every day raising money. And so much so that in, I believe, 2012, Huffington Post got their hands on an orientation packet for new members of Congress, and it had a model daily schedule. And it said 4 hours a day raising money, another 1 to 2 hours a day networking, and then 1 to 2 hours a day legislating. That is the introduction. I told a story on 60 Minutes that when I first got elected, it was March because it was a special election, and I had to turn around and run again in November. And understand, I was the most junior member of Congress because it was a special election. So I was 435 out of 435. Because it had been kind of this nationalized special election, all of the donor communities were exhausted. Nobody wanted to give me another dime. And leadership was concerned I wouldn't be able to raise money sufficient to get through a hard re-elect in November. And so a member of the majority leadership, it actually was the majority leader of the House, asked to meet with me. We met in a political conference room, and he said, I need to talk to you about November and how you're going to fundraise. And I thought, great, I need to know, like, how does the new kid raise money? He didn't have any advice for me. He had a direction, and the direction was, you have X number of days between now and November. You need $2 million. Your job is to raise $18,000 a day. And he turned to my deputy chief of staff who was in the room, and he said, Nick, your problem is you've got a new member who's excited to do all the things that he said he was going to do when he got here. You can't let him be distracted by that. He has to raise $18,000 a day. And within the next year, I've not only exposed kind of that corruption, but I took a pledge to never solicit another dollar again. And the optimism that came out of that, and we're seeing it like with Beto O'Rourke in Texas who swore off money, Bernie Sanders who tried to do low dollar. The moment I swore off direct fundraising, my fundraising actually went up because I think there's an appetite for that type of reform. But without a doubt, to your question, it would be the culture of fundraising and how that has so compromised decision-making in Congress.
Thank you, Congressman Jolly. You kind of touched on the idea of some of the structural problems in terms of financing. This is a question for both of you. What other structural and systemic problems do you think is causing the gridlock currently in Congress and even the divisive rhetoric in the country, and how can we solve it?
Sure. So I'll lay it out just in a list, and we can dive into a couple of them. It's hard to rank them, but if I had to pick the number one biggest problem, I would say it's the gerrymandering. Right? About 90% of congressional districts are predetermined. In other words, they're very Republican or very Democratic. And if you're in a safe, say, Democratic seat, the only election that matters is a primary election. And the average primary turnout is around 15% in a congressional race. Right? So 15% of the country is determining 90% of the members of Congress. And as a candidate or a member, you know exactly who those 15% are. And you're going to do and say whatever it takes to appeal to them to get their vote. And the other 85% don't really matter because they don't ever show up to vote. And it's pretty predictable. So that 15% drives most of the politics you're seeing right now in Washington, D.C. and in state houses as well. So we can dive into that. That's probably the biggest one to me. Number two is the money. David outlined it really well. I recommend you watch that 60 Minutes because it's appalling how bad the money is. And it's not just the amount of money that's corrupting. It's the amount of time members of Congress are spending to do it, because they're not doing their job. They're telemarketers. The third, I would say, is the media is becoming more and more polarized. 30 years ago, it was a couple stations that we all watched, and you had Walter Cronkite kind of telling you, here's what happened, it was the facts of the day, and everyone basically had the same set of facts. But nowadays, between a Fox or a CNN or MSNBC or a Breitbart and a Daily Kos and whatever the websites you go to, there's totally different sets of facts. A lot of opinion being injected into it, which is what we all tend to watch and crave more than the actual facts, because that's boring now. And then social media, and especially the younger generation getting most of their news on social media, which can be so targeted, right, and so manipulated. It's scary to think what happens in the next 5-10 years with that manipulation, and how we're all becoming more rigid in that. And Kamy, we could talk a little bit about that, panel we had on Sunday. We had a panel together, and sort of the psychology of this confirmation bias, and how we seek to find the news that we believe in. It's just easier on us. Like for me, I don't go to foxnews.com, right? It just pisses me off, so I don't ever go. But I'm guilty of it. I know, I admit it. So we all have to do a better job of finding that middle ground. So those are the first 3 obvious ones, I think, that get a lot of press. The next few, I never realized till I got there. Number 4, the lack of relationships between the members of Congress. Right? Members of Congress used to live in Washington. The kids went to school together, and they'd go play golf on weekends and hang out, and it didn't matter you're Republican, Democrat. You're friends, you're neighbors. That doesn't happen anymore. No one's there. So I was joking about the roommate thing, but it's true. If there was a budget for members of Congress to live together, that would be really helpful, because you'd break down some of the barriers. You build some trust. You realize, God, we're not that different, actually. So that's a big one. I think an realized problem, actually. The next one is the lack of earmarks. Congress used to have what are called earmarks. We can talk about it more if you'd like, but basically that was the sort of grease in the system that allowed for compromise and allowed for sort of the bargain to happen. And in anything in life, it might sound dirty, but you need that give and take, right? We all want to have a little bit of a win and not just have something crammed down our throat. So earmarks helped. They're no longer there anymore. Another one I'll point to is the cameras and committee rooms and all over Congress. Originally, I would have said, yeah, I want cameras. I want transparency, right? I want to see what the heck my member of Congress is saying and doing. Well, guess what? Every time there's a camera rolling, that member of Congress knows they need to put a show on for that 15%, right? Remember that 15% is going to vote for you? You got to put that little show on for them. Or remember those donors that you got to go call for money? They might be watching, and you got to go send them a clip. So you start playing this sort of role with the cameras. And the real conversation goes behind the closed doors, not in the committee where it should be. And then the last one is sort of the lack of regular order, where there was a process where members of Congress would work in a subcommittee, and you'd have experts come in, and you'd get some real good advice on a subject matter, and you bring it to the full committee. You'd have amendments, and you'd have more subject matter expertise, and you'd get more of a coalition, and then you'd go to the full House, and you get, hopefully a vote there. And you had buy-in from members of Congress to build on some legislation. That doesn't happen anymore. Leader Pelosi or Paul Ryan tell you what you're voting on an hour before it happens, and that's that. There's very little process to get there. And so we start to feel like, what are we doing? I can't even have this process, the intent, and we can't have this debate on these issues anymore. So anyway, all these issues, as you can tell, are connected. And if you could fix just one of them, they would all improve. But we think there's opportunity to fix a lot of them, actually.
I would just add a piece of context. The move towards top-down, leadership-driven legislative agendas coincides also with the emergence of large outside money in politics. And so the agenda that the party leadership sets is driven by the fact that party leadership have the closest relationships to that outside donor base, where they're having to cultivate $200 to $300 million a cycle. And so they care less about regular order and more about ensuring that come next November, they're going to have the money lined up for their reelect.
Thank you. Maybe, Congressman John, if you could talk more on that. What is the role of special interests play in politics, and how did both of you kind of experience that in your time in Congress, and how did you kind of navigate that through your frustrations in those areas?
So I have a scandalous confession to make. I was once a registered federal lobbyist. And you better believe when I decided to run for Congress, my opponent made sure every single voter knew that Jolly was this dirty lobbyist, right? Now, fortunately, I kind of had white glove clients. I represented research universities, surviving parents who had lost their children to sexual predators, a number of VA and kind of DOD special programs. But I say that because it informs how I'm about to answer the question. Members of Congress have a limited staff and limited subject matter expertise, not just themselves, but also among their staff. And unless as a country we decide that we want to dramatically escalate the amount of funding that we provide members of Congress to bring subject matter experts in the door, the reality is in today's environment, some of the best expertise is actually from industry experts who get paid to educate and inform the Congress. We think about kind of special interest and lobbying being dirty because we think of the cash transaction, right? The transactional lobbying that comes along with donations. It does not happen as egregiously as you might picture, but we know it's there. We know that members of Congress are always considering, will I have sufficient resources for my next reelection? The bottom line for me on special interests is this. Consider who holds the public trust. The person who holds the public trust is the elected official, not the lobbyist. An elected official could spend time deciding where they want to gather their information. And at times, as a member of Congress, I would call a telecommunications lobbyist, right? We had a large cable company headquartered in my district. And so if there's a telecommunications issue, I might call the telecommunications lobbyist to say, tell me more about this. But at the same time, I was giving equal voice to constituents who were saying, why is my cable bill going through the roof, and why is this consolidation happening? The point at which voters should inject accountability is upon the members' decision-making at that moment. Right? The lobbyist doesn't hold a public trust. They have no responsibility to you and I. They have a responsibility to their client. The constituent doesn't really hold a public trust, right? They have a voice in democracy just like the rest of us do. But we have uniquely positioned elected officials and members of Congress with our public trust. And if somebody makes a decision based on a special interest relationship or with the knowledge or forethought of a donation, and they allow that to pervert their decision-making, that's the point at which we need to inject accountability and throw that person out. So it is easy to have disdain for the special interest community, and I'm not here to suggest we need to increase their favorability ratings today. That's not my point. But I would encourage you to always focus in on where's the breakdown, and the breakdown is at the public official level, not at the lobbyist level.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Murphy, you kind of talked about the idea of how congressmen are putting party over country, and Congressman Jolly, you just talked about the idea of like perversion of responsibility. So have we reached a point in Congress where congressmen are acting selfishly rather than on behalf of their constituents?
Yes, and it's human nature in a sense, right? You want to keep your job, whatever that job is. You want to stay enrolled at school, you get your first job, you're going to want to keep it probably. Members of Congress want to keep their job. And part of keeping your job is understanding the system. So when you understand that system, you know, hey, I'm here, now I've got to get reelected. Well, how do I get reelected? Typically, the person with the most money wins in politics. So you start fundraising right away. That was a shock to me when I first got elected. As David kind of told his story, the same experience for me. You know, I thought I was going to get to Congress and start legislating and working on these big issues, but the first thing I had to do is go pick up the phone and start begging for money. So I was elected in, I guess, November 6, 2012. You get sworn in January 3rd, 2013, like 2 months later. In that 2-month period there was already like 2 people that were running against me and talking trash about me. And I'm like, wait, I haven't even voted yet. What do you mean? How can you run against me? And so, but imagine that's you and you just get elected. What are you going to like roll over and be like, oh, I'm not, you know, no, you're going to fight. No, I'm going to get reelected. I'm here. I worked this hard to get here. I'm going to keep it, right? So it's human nature. So that you play by this broken system and you start fundraising, right? And then you start realizing, oh, well, who's going to vote for me in that midterm election now? Who are those voters? What do they care about? How do I get there? What do I do? And guess what? I can't be in D.C. on weekends to go hang out with my Republican friends or get to know them because I got to get home and start campaigning. So you leave Congress right after your last vote on, say, a Thursday. You get on that first plane, you get home, you go to the Chamber of Commerce meeting, or you go to a march, or you go fundraise, or you go do whatever it is, but you're in public campaigning right away. And so all these things start, kind of creating a dynamic where, yes, people are putting themselves and their own reelection first. And what happens is you start to justify it. You just say, well, gosh, I'm here, and, if I'm not in Congress, I can't vote, and I can't make a decision. So I'm going to do what it takes to stay here, to keep this seat, so I do have a voice. And then I'm going to be here a little bit longer because guess what? If I'm the chairman of my committee, then I can really do something. If I'm the Speaker of the House, then I'm going to do what I think is right. But until then, I'm going to do what it takes to get there, right? So people start justifying decisions that they might not agree with because that's what it takes to keep that power. And maybe it's for the best of reasons, right? Maybe it's an issue they really want to get pushed forward, but along the way, they're going to have to make some sacrifices that David and I don't think is really helping the country.
Because I really do want us to not get bogged down on some of the frustrations. This is the perfect jumping off point to something he mentioned. What Patrick highlighted is why members of Congress behave in this way, right? Why are they behaving selfishly, if you will? Imagine an environment in which the rewards are not for fundraising, and the rewards are not for following leadership, and the rewards are not for just staying on your side of the aisle. But imagine a system where there are rewards for bipartisanship, for showing independence, for putting your constituents first. We got a taste of that. I particularly got a taste of that in a 50-50 district. So though the special election was hyper-partisan, and I got branded as a crazy conservative and my opponent as a crazy progressive, the reality is I was able to demonstrate to this relatively diverse community that I was willing as a Republican to speak about issues of marriage equality and climate change and campaign finance reform and gun reforms. They were messages that voters had not heard Republicans typically speak about, but they reflected where my district was in a hyper-competitive environment. That's an area where we can change that. When we talk about gerrymandering, suppose a world in which instead of 90% of the districts being supermajority, we intentionally, through construct of state constitutions, require lines to be drawn as electorally competitive as possible. What if we required as many members of Congress as mathematically possible to now run in 50-50 districts, where there was a reward for them to begin to show a bit of bipartisanship? Suppose we visit the primary system and say, you know what? Closed primaries have a role, right? Parties have a role. The Supreme Court has said closed primaries are constitutional. But let's say as voters we made a value judgment and said, we actually want a primary system where every voter has an opportunity to vote regardless of party registration. Then the incentive for Patrick and I and other candidates would be to say, okay, there are actually more votes than those that are just within my party. How do I redirect my messaging and begin to talk about issues that address a broader part of the community? So I say that because it's a perfect example, your question of self-interest. The self-interest is within the rules as they're written now. We think we can rewrite the rules and channel that self-interest for the good.
Thank you both for that. I'm kind of going off of that for this question for both of you. How, as our younger generation, we are statistically just don't come out and turn out to vote as often. What can we do to incentivize younger voters to come out and vote and make sure that they're not voting on these party lines, but really looking and kind of trying to find these bipartisan nuggets within those members of Congress and really make sure that they're voting for people based on that instead of these kind of gridlocked issues? You guys have any opinions on that?
I'll defer to the first millennial elected to Congress.
You hate to be cliche and say you got to vote, but I mean, that's sort of the bottom line. But what's the problem with voting is the barriers to it, right? It's a pain. Nothing you all millennials, or maybe this is Gen Z. How old's everyone? 18, 19 Z? Oh, boy. Damn it. I'm getting old. So I can't say we anymore. Yeah. I used to be able to say we. It doesn't work so much. So Gen Z, there's not much that you do where you go wait in line anymore. You have Amazon Prime. Your news is right here. Everything we do is on the fingertips. And the thought, especially in states like Florida, where you have to go wait in the sun for 2-3 hours to vote, take off work, maybe you have a child that you're leaving or they're with you, or a mother you're taking care of, and you got to wait 3 hours in the sun. And people are fainting all the time in Florida. I mean, it's a mess. It's like so foreign. And then you're looking at this system where nothing's working, where it's just gridlock, people are yelling at each other. It's kind of deflating. So it's kind of a cat and mouse, though, and I think there's a lot that can be done through ballot initiatives, though, like David's saying, for example, where you open up primaries, where independents in Florida right now are not allowed to vote in a primary, right? So 30% of the state has no voice right off the bat. So why don't we open that up? Let them have a voice, right? Makes them more encouraged to go vote in the general election. Why don't we make it easier to vote? Of course we need voter security. Of course we can do all that, but there is trillions of dollars of money transferred every day, right, on the internet. I'm sure there's ways to make it more secure. With blockchain and some new technologies, I'm sure there's some great ideas, hopefully that will come forward and will see the light of day to make voting easier, because we should be encouraging more people to do it. And I think that's one of the big things that's going to be needed to get the next generation involved, is make it easier, but then also have some issues of importance to you addressed. And since not enough millennials and Zs are running for office, we're not seeing that. I started a little group called the Future Forum Foundation in Congress. That's all about the future of work, right? With automation and the sharing economy, artificial intelligence, with student debt issues. None of this is being addressed in Congress, right? We're fighting fights from like 20 years ago in the Congress and not looking forward at all. And in a sense, you look at our competitors, China, for example, has a 50 and 100 and 150-year plan about what they're going to do. We're not doing that. We don't have that vision. I think if there was an inspirational vision by the Congress and elected officials, maybe people would want to get involved. That's something they'd want to be a part of, but we're not seeing that.
If I may, two quick anecdotes of motivation, if nothing else. Just breaking this morning, there's a story out of Rolling Stone that in the governor's race in Georgia, which is more competitive than historically it would seem it should be, the Republican candidate is only ahead by a point or two over the Democratic candidate. She may be the first African-American female elected governor, I believe, in the history of the country. There is a recording that leaked out where candidate Kemp, the Republican candidate, said, "I'm concerned if people get out and exercise their right to vote, we might lose this." It's actually the candidate's concern is that if we see voter turnout grow, that the race is going to get away from me. That should be motivation, that we have candidates hoping you don't vote, right? The other piece I'd give you, Patrick and I had an opportunity to visit with the father of one of the Parkland victims, Fred Gutenberg. He was out on the West Coast this past week, and he said something that stuck with me, and I hope it may be something that sticks with you. He said to Patrick, actually, who Patrick was a congressman in Fred's local area, he said, "My only regret is I didn't get involved in politics before I lost my daughter." He has become an activist, obviously around the issue of guns, but also just more broadly. He is involved in politics. He lives it and breathes it. And here was a father whose one lament was that he didn't get involved in politics when it was boring. But he wishes he had, because he felt like he could have been effective in making changes.
Garen, Austin, if I may, you've both done a terrific job of asking some very insightful questions. This is a terrific insights that we're getting from the congressman. If I can, I wanted to open it up a little bit to the folks that are here in the limited time that we have. Some of you, I'm sure, have some really great questions that you'd like to ask as well. And so Garen and Austin have graciously agreed to bring over the microphone to you. So if you do have a question, I hope you do, if you can't, just put your hand up. And so one of these two gentlemen will come to your side so you have an opportunity to ask whatever is on your mind. Yes, sir, with the sunflower shirt.
For Representative Murphy, so we talked about how you were trying to work bipartisanly with the Republican to get the government waste spending bill passed. But is there any time where you were trying to work bipartisanly where the Democratic Party pressured you not to work with the Republican?
Great question, great point, and I actually usually make that point. I didn't today. I didn't mean to tell that story to sound partisan. That wasn't my intent, because Democrats do the same exact things to Republicans. And in the case of David Jolly, it happened to him on shooting, on a gun bill. Because of the Pulse nightclub shooting, David put forward a bill that improved a Democratic bill, and the Democrats blocked him from doing it because they were trying to beat him. So both parties are guilty of this, right? And both parties are guilty of gerrymandering. Both parties are guilty of the fundraising and the lobbyists and the money and all these things we talk about. This isn't like a one-side thing. I think David makes the point better than me that had Democrats figured out gerrymandering a little sooner, they probably would have done it as well. It just took them a little while to figure it out. Newt Gingrich in '94 started manipulating the system and was really good at not only getting money for Republicans in Congress, but then for the state houses and the state legislatures to then start redesigning districts. And after 20 years of this, we now have a really broken system that hopefully we can unwind.
Just from an academic standpoint, understand how dramatic it was when Newt Gingrich and the Republicans took over in '94 and engaged in this 50-state strategy. The state of Georgia provided a perfect example of what they were able to accomplish. The delegation at the time had been, I believe, 8 Democrats and 3 Republicans. And within one redistricting cycle, they flipped it to 8 Republicans and 3 Democrats. And understand what that means for creating a majority in the Congress for decades to come. You go state by state. All of a sudden, you create an environment where, listen, the biggest challenge for Republicans is in the last 7 presidential elections, they've only won the popular vote once. But they've been able to construct a system in such a way that protects this majority that's getting away from them. And then the converse of that is true. Democrats have the challenge of the flyover states. We know they win the coast and the urban areas, but they've yet to bring along those flyover states. It's two sides of the same coin, but by rigging the system, the majority is able to protect themselves from consequences.
Any other questions? Yes, ma'am, right here in the pink glasses. Microphone's coming to you.
So you talked some about earning the public trust, and we've talked about structural barriers within your different parties, whether it's people telling you how to vote or what that is. But since you represented kind of the opposite political party, and how do you find that you're crossing bipartisan lines with your constituents, and what do you think, what part of the dialogue needs to change between your constituents when it comes to crossing bipartisan lines, not just structurally in Congress, but in the structure of public discourse?
So I'll just say David and I were really lucky in a sense that we are in that 10% of districts that are bipartisan, right, that you can be bipartisan and that are swing districts. And it enabled us to be ourselves, because that's truly who we are. I truly believe in cooperation and that both parties have good ideas to offer, and then somewhere in the middle you can have lasting legislation. But we also have colleagues that are equally, bipartisan and willing to do that and have that same spirit that happen to be in a district where they can't do that. So they have to play a role. I sometimes make the joke that D.C. is Hollywood for ugly people, right? Because they become actors and they're playing a certain part to get reelected. Not you, David. You're very handsome. Yeah. But to your point about the constituents, things have also changed, though, from 2012 till now. The world has become more polarized, not just the U.S. and I would venture to say my district, the former district, has as well. And so I won my first election by 2,000 votes, give or take. That was 0.6%. Won my re-election 2 years later by 20%. That meant we had something like 30% of Republicans vote for us, right? Anthony, my campaign manager and chief of staff, is here with us. So we had something like 33% of Republicans ended up crossing the aisle to vote for us. And you say, that's crazy. Nowadays, people are so partisan. Different time, again, things were different, but I focused on local issues. I ran like a mayor. All politics is local, that saying, and focused on some local environmental issues we had, and that was my issue, and I championed that, and I think because of that was rewarded for it. And the constituents were cool with it, right? They wanted that, and they were okay to vote for a Democrat. I can't tell you how many times, heck, we did a TV commercial where older man, farmers, probably, I think he was actually literally 90 years old, said, I've never voted for a Democrat in my life, and Patrick Murphy's the first one I'm voting for, right? And it's anecdotal, but I think people do want to have that if they can see that representative being bipartisan. And we are in districts where we were able to do that. It's too bad there's not more of that. I would also say, though, things have gotten a lot worse in the last 4 years for various reasons we can get into. And I sometimes fear it's going to get a little bit worse before it gets better. And we're about to, I think, enter divided government with a Democratic House and Republican president and Senate. And it'll be interesting to watch how that all plays out.
Yes, in the back, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for coming, first of all. And my question is regarding, so you talked about voter turnout and social media too. And my question kind of like touches on the involvement of Hollywood in politics. So I just want to know, like, what's your opinion regarding that? Like, is it more detrimental for the voters, or is it more helpful for them to get informed? Is it misleading?
I think the more voices in the arena, the better. From a strictly academic standpoint, we also have to recognize, and I think as voters who seek information, there's a bell curve in every industry, including politics. So who we choose as voices to inform our decision making may simply be on passions. We agree with certain passions, and that's fine. I'm bring to politics a little bit of wonkiness as a policy person, so it sometimes frustrates me that people will ignore policy and vote for passion, but that's fine, right? Look, we're in an environment where you can say each of the last 2 presidential elections were, yes, about substance, but we know we each sold passion. Barack Obama sold hope, Donald Trump sold fear, and it was effective for each one of them. So you can't extract that. The more voices, the better, including if they're from Hollywood or the person down the street, in my opinion.
We have time for one more question. Yes.
So obviously over the past couple of years, we've seen the country become more and more divided. And one of those lines that we're dividing on are racial lines. So over the past years, we've seen the Democratic Party and the broader left become increasingly anti-American and anti-white. And we've seen, I've got a couple of examples. There's a DNC chair candidate who said that my job will be to shut other white people down. There is New York Governor Cuomo saying America was never really that great. And Sarah Jeong of the New York Times editorial board said that white people have stopped breeding. You'll go extinct soon. This was my plan all along. So taking into account these increasing racial tensions, how are Republicans, a party that is 89% white, supposed to compromise with a party that is so blatantly hostile and hateful towards European Americans?
So what I would suggest is that you can find voices of hate across the political spectrum. You can find voices that try to shut down diversity across the political spectrum. Regardless of the party affiliations that any of those voices choose, I think the greater calling for all of us as Americans is to reject hate and to reject that type of racial animus, regardless of whose voice it is. But I think it's very important that we always very objectively study all of those voices, because I think there are voices in government right now that just as you may assign culpability on the left, I think it's very fair to assign culpability to some of the voices on the right as well.
And I think it's worth sort of broadening this a little bit to think about why this is being done politically. Right, we're in a time now where certain issues have been injected into the system for very political reasons. Choice is an issue. It was always a topic, but it's become a very serious wedge issue that Democrats think favors them and Republicans think favor them, and the parties, the systems themselves are trying to drive that wedge. There are groups that are trying to, drive cultural divides. Right? There's a reason the Russians are trying to inflame, the sort of racism in our country, because they know we're susceptible to it. And if you look globally around the world, at some of the recent elections in Germany and Sweden, even in Brazil, what's happening now, a lot of that is based on some of the fears of immigration, whether it's the Syrians, whether it's Mexicans in our country, and that's being used to divide us. I think we should all kind of look at what it's being done, but look beyond that and hopefully see us as better people than that and more sophisticated, more educated, and see beyond some of that and understand what this country was built on, right? And understand that immigration made us who we are, right? That we are this great melting pot, and we should embrace that. And yes, we need to, protect our borders, and yes, there's so much more we can do, but we also should embrace that and have that empathy and continue to be that world leader and not fall victim to that sort of weakness that is, some of our deeper spirits in so many of us.
Folks, Thank you, Congressman Murphy. Thank you, Congressman Jolly. Thank you, Garen. Thank you, Austin. Thank you, Mark and Jeannie and Alice from the library. It's been a tremendous exchange. Let me just offer one last perspective before we conclude, and that is this. You'll note that both congressmen are here in a personal capacity. They are not currently elected members. They're here because they are super citizens, and they have identified some very specific issues that we can target, that we can use to fix this broken system. I think it's remarkable that in their own personal capacity, they've taken the time to not only tour Pepperdine today, they were at UCLA and USC yesterday, they're at Politicon over the weekend. This is like a rock star tour, right? They're going to be in Berkeley, they're going to be at Stanford tomorrow. Right. But they're making a great big personal sacrifice, and I think that's really commendable. And so to those of us who are seeking inspiration to what is dividing us today, I think we look to their example and say thank you so much. And thank you to the junior version of Jolly and Murphy in the room that is here today. And so, absolutely, thank you. Absolutely. So with that, I wanted to offer a couple of parting thoughts. One is that ProCon and the Village Square have organized this event. This is not where the conversation stops. This is where the conversation will continue on and on and on and on until we fix the problem that is dividing our country. We can fix it. We have to use the two things, our vote. Everybody tells you go vote. Yeah, of course. Use your voice. That's our other superpower. Your voice matters a lot. It's what happens before, during, and after elections. And that voice can be used to impact these specific things. Closed primaries, you don't like that? Use your voice. Go to one of the NGOs. There's probably dozens of them focused on being able to open up primaries. Dark money in politics, if that's something you care about, there's a Center for Responsive Politics. There's a Sunlight Foundation. There's 20 foundations and NGOs working in that capacity. Gerrymandering, if that's important to you, there's so many organizations, including some here in Los Angeles, that are hyper-focused on changing gerrymandering. Media, traditional media, social media, how to disrupt the echo chambers, absolutely things that you can use your voice to focus on. And I emphasize that because they are here as individuals. They are here as just people. We are all people. We all can use and exercise those same powers. So that said, thank you for your participation. We brought ProCon swag. We hope you walk away with a shirt, a button, or one of our DVDs that goes back to the origins of these talking heads on TV bashing each other. This is 1968 Democratic and Republican National Convention documented in the film Best of Enemies. Fascinating. If you want to see where this bashing started, it started there. If you want to know what the antidote is, look in the mirror. Thank you so much, Congressman Jolly. Congressman Murphy. Thank you, Pepperdine.